She didn't hear the room fall silent so much as feel it, the way sound drains out of a space when people decide someone is about to be humiliated, and they don't want to miss a second of it. The marble lobby of the hotel gleamed under chandelier light, polished floors reflecting gold across the crowd of executives and investors clustered near the velvet seating. Conversations thinned, movements slowed, eyes sharpened. In the center of it all, he stood with his hand extended, steady, respectful, professional, and she stared at it like it was something beneath her. Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Her lips curved into that small, polished smile powerful people wear when they're about to do something cruel, but want it to look like a standard procedure. She didn't refuse quickly. That was the cruelty. She let the moment breathe. She let the pause bloom into judgment. She let him feel it. Her gaze traveled, from his shoes to his polo, to the leather portfolio at his side, and every second of that inspection said more than words ever could. Behind her, two men in tailored suits watched with faint amusement, as if the scene were another item on the day's agenda. A woman across the lobby raised her phone, pretending to check her screen while angling the camera toward him. Someone whispered, and the whisper spread. Quiet, satisfied, predatory. He kept his hand out because pulling it back now would mean he accepted the verdict. He kept his voice calm, even as heat pressed against his chest. We have a 9 o'clock meeting, he said softly. Series C discussion. She tilted her head, the gesture elegant and sharp. With us? Her tone didn't question. It dismissed. The words slid out coated in disbelief, then in something colder. This is a closed meeting. For serious partners. The phrase landed like a gavel. He felt the shift ripple outward, the way a crowd adapts to a narrative it likes. The security desk flickered with movement. A suited manager glanced over. Phones rose higher. She didn't step back from him. She stepped forward, invading his space with the confidence of someone who had never once wondered whether she belonged. You must have misunderstood, she said, voice silk-lined but tight. This isn't the kind of room you just walk into. Her fingers stayed locked around the strap of her purse, as if touching him would contaminate the scene she was staging. That was when he understood. This wasn't confusion. It was performance. A public ritual. Something rehearsed over a lifetime of being told she was the standard everyone else had to prove themselves against. The two executives behind her watched the moment like spectators at a demonstration. One smirked. The other checked his watch. Not out of impatience, but out of confidence that this outcome was inevitable. He tried again, not pleading, not defending, simply offering facts. Your office confirmed. 3 weeks ago. He spoke as if the truth might still matter here. She laughed, quiet, refined, dismissive. The kind of laugh that doesn't sound loud, but still manages to echo. Of course they did, she said. People like you are always confirmed when they show up without invitations. People like you. The phrase didn't explode. It sank. He had heard versions of it before, in classrooms, at conferences, in lobbies where doors pretended to be open until someone decided they weren't. He breathed slowly, because anger here would only prove the story she was building around him. If you check. I don't need to check, she cut in. Her eyes hardened, the performance sharpened, cameras steadied. The spectators leaned in. Security. The word snapped through the lobby like a command that had been waiting its entire life to be used. 2 guards began crossing the floor. One was older, his expression tight with apology. The other looked straight ahead, trained to move without question. He lowered his hand then, not out of defeat, but because the moment no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her, to the story she wanted to tell in front of an audience. You're disrupting a private meeting, she said loudly enough for every pair of listening ears to hear. Please escort him out. Gasps didn't appear, approval did. That polite, satisfied quiet made of people pretending to be uncomfortable while enjoying the spectacle. The kind of silence where judgment becomes entertainment. The older guard hesitated for half a second, eyes flicking to the man with something like understanding. Then duty swallowed it. "Sir, we need you to leave." He nodded once, not because he agreed, but because arguing here would give them a better ending to the show. As they began walking, he felt the way the room weighed him, documented him, decided who he was. A woman shifted aside as if his presence were air she didn't want to breathe. Someone murmured, "Unprofessional." Another said, "How did he even get in?" They didn't speak to him. They spoke around him, the way people do when they've already chosen a verdict. He kept his back straight, his steps measured. Dignity, he had learned, was sometimes a form of resistance. Behind him, she brushed invisible dust from her sleeve, as though removing the last trace of him from her mourning. She had that calm, satisfied stillness of someone certain their judgment would never be questioned. Someone who believed cruelty wasn't cruelty if it was delivered with etiquette. She didn't look at him as he left. She didn't need to. In her mind, the scene was over, lesson delivered, order restored. The doors opened to the cold morning light, and the air hit his face like water. Outside, traffic moved, indifferent to humiliation. He paused for a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, feeling the thin burn of anger and the heavier weight of something older. Not surprise, not shock, just exhaustion from a lifetime of rooms like this. The older guard leaned closer and whispered, "I'm sorry." He nodded again because the apology wasn't for this moment alone. It was for all the others that looked like it. Inside, the lobby exhaled and conversations resumed, except now every voice carried the faint thrill of having witnessed something they thought confirmed the order of the world. She turned back to her companions, smiling as if she had removed a problem rather than a person. In her mind, she had won something, claimed status, protected territory, proven superiority in front of the right audience. She didn't realize she had just stepped into a different kind of stage, one far larger than this marble floor, one where humiliation doesn't end when the cameras stop recording. He looked back at the building once, not with longing, not with regret, but with clarity. Something had been decided here, not about him, about her. He knew, in that quiet place beneath anger, that this moment would not vanish when the doors closed. It would echo, it would travel. And before the day was over, the world she believed was unshakable would begin to tilt. But inside that lobby, beneath the chandeliers, she still stood certain of her victory, certain the power in that room belonged only to her, never realizing she had just walked herself, slowly and deliberately, into a trap she could no longer step out of. Morning light filtered through the curtains of his small apartment in a way that made the room feel quieter than it really was, the kind of quiet that comes after a long night of thinking instead of sleeping. The leather portfolio from the lobby rested on the kitchen table, still closed, still untouched, as if opening it now would admit that yesterday had actually happened. He poured coffee slowly, careful not to spill, careful not to rush, because there were parts of his life that required steadiness, no matter what the world decided about him. The apartment wasn't large, but it was lived in with intention. Framed photos lined the wall above the bookshelf, his mother smiling in her nurse's uniform, his sister on her graduation day, a worn photo of him at 16 standing outside the small brick house where they used to live, his hand on the hood of a car that refused to start unless coaxed into motion with patience and hope. That house still belonged to his mother, even though the bank had almost taken it once, back when medical bills stacked higher than courage. He had promised himself that would never happen again. That was the first time he understood stakes, not in boardrooms or investment decks, but in the quiet sound of a mother trying not to cry at the kitchen table. He rinsed his mug and checked his phone. 3 new emails from the hospital's billing office, one from his sister asking if he could help cover another semester of tuition, a reminder about his nephew's school fundraiser, and a message from the landlord of his mother's rental unit saying the roof leak had worsened again. He read every line, not with irritation, but with the careful attention of someone who carried obligations like anchors he refused to drop. Yesterday's humiliation hadn't changed any of that. Rent still needed to be paid. Prescriptions still had to be filled. The world never pauses because someone was embarrassed in public. He opened the window and let the city breathe into the room. Traffic, footsteps, A distant siren. The low hum of a world that had no idea what had unfolded beneath a chandelier. He thought of the way she had looked at him, not as a mistake, not as a miscommunication, but as a decision. A verdict made before he ever spoke. He had met people like her before, the ones who believed kindness was optional, but authority was not. Yet something about this time stayed with him. Maybe it was the way the room participated, the way silence joined the performance. Or maybe it was because, for a split second, he had felt 16 again, standing in a hardware store while a clerk told him the discount rack was in the back, because guys like you don't usually browse up front. He exhaled slowly and turned to the corner of the apartment where a violin case rested on a small chair. He had bought it secondhand years ago, back when he still believed music might have been the life he could have chosen if money and responsibility hadn't arrived first. His father used to say that every person carries a symbol of who they were supposed to become. For him, it was this violin. Not because he still played well, but because it reminded him there was once a future that wasn't this heavy. He lifted the case, opened it, and let his fingers hover over the strings without touching them. Not today. Today required other kinds of strength. His phone buzzed again. A name appeared on the screen. 2 rings, then a pause. And he answered before the third, his voice careful and warm, in the way someone speaks when they know the person on the other end needs softness more than speed. "Morning, Ma," he said. She didn't ask how he was. She asked about the meeting, the way mothers do when they sense pride or injury in the spaces between words. He told her enough to keep her from worrying, and not enough to let pain spill into her day. She sighed and said, "Some people can't see the truth, even when it shakes their hand." He smiled faintly, even though she couldn't see it. Before hanging up, she asked if he'd be able to drop by on Sunday to help fix the back steps, and he said of course, because no matter what rooms he walked through, his life was measured in the promises he kept. After the call, he grabbed his jacket and the portfolio and headed out, taking the same bus he had taken for years, even after he could afford a car, because old habits sometimes felt like roots. He found a seat near the middle and stared out the window as the city moved in layers. Coffee carts steaming at the curb, tired workers stepping into the day, children dragging backpacks that looked almost as big as their bodies. Across from him sat the elderly security guard from the hotel, the same man who had walked beside him to the door the day before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the guard nodded, the kind of small, respectful nod men exchange when words would only cheapen what they both understand. "I was hoping I'd run into you," the guard said quietly, his voice worn from decades of swallowing feelings he had never been paid to show. "I saw what happened. I saw all of it." The man didn't ask for reassurance. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply looked at him like a witness, not to the humiliation, but to the dignity that survived it. "You didn't deserve that," the guard continued. "I've worked that lobby 27 years. I've watched a lot of people walk through pretending they own it. Yesterday was the first time I wished I could stop a moment from happening." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, I saw you. Not what they decided you were." The bus rattled over a pothole, and for a brief second the city noise faded beneath the quiet understanding between 2 men who knew exactly how fragile belonging could be in certain rooms. That small exchange settled inside him like a weight he wanted to carry. Not burden, but proof that the world still contained witnesses, people who recognized truth even when power tried to disguise it. He stepped off at the next stop and walked past a playground where children shouted and laughed with the kind of joy untouched by hierarchy. He thought of the decisions ahead of him, the offers waiting, the partnership proposals that would shape the next decade of his life. He had come to that lobby because he believed the company might become something meaningful. Because he had seen potential buried under bad leadership and arrogance and thought maybe he could help shift its course. He wasn't naive. He didn't invest in people who treated others like obstacles. But he also knew that sometimes the right intervention at the right moment could keep 1,000 families from losing their livelihoods. That was the part no one in those chandeliers ever seemed to understand. When powerful people fail, it is never only their world that falls apart. He stopped at a corner bakery and bought a loaf of bread, one for himself, one for his mother, then checked the time. He had another meeting across town, one where he knew his name would not be doubted at the door, where his presence wouldn't be weighed against stereotypes before he spoke. Still, the memory of yesterday followed him like a slow echo. He wasn't angry at the humiliation itself. He had lived long enough to know it was only one of many, but at the way the room had agreed with it. He replayed the older guard's whisper, the apology woven with years of forced silence, and felt something shift in him. This wasn't just about an insult. It was about what it revealed, about her, about the company, about the entire system that allowed arrogance to masquerade as competence. He tightened his grip on the portfolio and exhaled, steady and measured. He didn't know yet that the decisions made in the hours ahead would ripple far beyond that lobby. He didn't know that her world, the one she believed untouchable, was already beginning to strain under the weight of what she'd done. But he knew this much. Silence was no longer an option. And somewhere, deep beneath anger and exhaustion and memory, he understood that yesterday hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning. By the time the afternoon sun angled across the glass towers of the financial district, the story of the lobby, or rather the version of it that the room chose to believe, had already begun to travel. Not as a scandal, not yet, but as a whisper passed across desks and conference tables, reshaped every time it changed hands. Some guy tried to bluff his way into a meeting. Security had to escort him out. You know how these people try to get access. Each retelling trimmed away truth and replaced it with convenience. In her office high above the city, she listened to one of her executives recount the moment like a minor inconvenience, another example of her decisiveness under pressure, and she nodded with a composed confidence that made the story feel settled, finished, archived under winds. She told herself she had protected the integrity of the meeting. She told herself that leadership meant filtering out people who didn't belong. She told herself, as she always had, that discomfort was simply resistance from those who hadn't earned proximity to power. But there was a sliver of something beneath all those assurances, faint, thin, almost imperceptible, that flickered when she replayed the exact instant he lowered his hand and refused to argue. Not anger, not defiance, not fear. Clarity. It brushed against her certainty like a cold current, and then vanished before she could name it. She ignored it. She had a presentation to finalize, a board call to prepare for, and a reputation to maintain in a room where reputations were currency. Outside her office, employees moved faster than usual, not out of urgency, but because tension hums through a company quietly when something feels off at the top. The lobby incident had made its way through internal chat threads, not with outrage, but with the kind of cautious curiosity people develop when they've seen enough to know that speaking too directly about power is dangerous. A few had watched from a distance yesterday, reception staff, junior analysts, the janitor who'd been polishing the rail near the elevators. They hadn't said anything, not then, but they remembered how the air felt when she refused his hand, brittle, sharp, pre-decided. Phones were already involved before security took a single step. By late afternoon, one of those phones belonged to a blogger who specialized in corporate culture stories. The clip wasn't long, just enough to frame the silence, the gesture, the word security ringing across marble. And it circulated softly, cautiously, like a match rolled between fingers. Meanwhile, he sat in a quiet conference room across town, the portfolio open at last, numbers and charts and risk profiles spread across the table, as if they belonged to an entirely different world than the one that humiliated him. His analyst walked him through projections, the potential turnaround path, the technology buried beneath ego. He listened, thoughtful, distant, hearing more than the numbers. If the right leadership steps in, she said carefully, this company could stabilize in 18 months. But under the current structure, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. He saw it. The culture, the entitlement, the brittle arrogance that rotted an organization from the top down long before the financials reflected it. He thought of the faces in the lobby, the way the crowd aligned with cruelty without needing instruction, and he realized the company's greatest risk wasn't its burn rate. It was its center of gravity. He set his pen down, and a decision began to form. Not impulsive, not vengeful. A decision born from every family he'd ever seen. lose jobs because someone at the top believed their assumptions were smarter than reality. Outside the conference room, his phone vibrated. A message from someone who had been in the lobby yesterday. Not an executive, not a partner, the older security guard. Just 3 words. I saw everything. He closed his eyes for a second, letting the weight of those words settle. The arena was expanding. The moment wasn't staying contained inside chandeliers. Back in her building, an assistant knocked on her door, nervous in a way that tried not to be visible. You may want to see this, she said, placing a tablet on the desk. On the screen, the short lobby clip played, grainy, angled, incomplete, but enough. Enough to show the refusal. Enough to show the ease with which she delivered it. Enough to show the man who never raised his voice. For a fraction of a second, the flicker returned, brighter this time. The sense that she hadn't just managed an interruption, she had misjudged something. Who posted this? She asked, voice level, almost bored, but the grip on her pen tightened. Unconfirmed, the assistant replied. It's starting to circulate. She forced a small smile. These things disappear by morning. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. But somewhere beneath her certainty, a single question surfaced before she could drown it. What if he hadn't been who she assumed he was? The thought was intrusive, unwelcome, and she pushed it away. That was when a second notification appeared, a message from one of the 2 visiting investors who had witnessed the scene. The wording was polite. The tone was not. We should discuss leadership alignment, some concerns about yesterday. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air too still. For the first time, she replayed the moment from a different angle, not as the protagonist of a decisive act, but as someone whose reaction might have revealed more than she wanted it to. The flicker didn't linger. Pride smothered it quickly. But it had arrived, and its presence tightened the world around her inch by inch. Across the city, he stood on a rooftop terrace between meetings, watching the skyline as dusk softened the edges of the buildings. The decision crystallized. Silence would allow the pattern to continue, not just for him, but for every person who would one day stand in that lobby with their dignity weighed against someone else's prejudice. He didn't want revenge. He wanted accountability. He wanted truth to exist somewhere louder than whispers. He took a breath and made a call. Not to a reporter, not to a board member. To someone whose voice reached into corners where powerful people assumed no one was listening. He explained what happened, calmly, factually, without exaggeration. When he hung up, he felt something settle in his chest, not relief, resolve. By evening, the conversation inside her building had shifted tone. The executives spoke in lowered voices, slipping phrases like optics, context, and narrative framing into sentences that pretended to be about strategy. Her reflection in the glass wall looked composed, immaculate, inevitable. Yet when she blinked, she saw for a split second the man's steady expression in the lobby, the absence of desperation in his eyes, and the flicker returned, sharper now, whispering one quiet, terrifying possibility. Maybe she had been wrong. The arena tightened around them both. The lobby, the office, the city, the invisible network of witnesses and conversations and consequences, drawing them toward a moment where neither could back away without losing something. He understood now that stepping forward might cost him peace, privacy, convenience, but stepping back would cost something far greater. For her, the cost had not yet arrived, but the ground beneath her confidence was beginning to tremble, almost imperceptibly, like a structure that had been standing for years and only just discovered its foundation was cracked. Night fell, and from opposite sides of the city, they each made a choice, not spoken aloud, not written down, but carried in the way their hands stilled, in the way their breath slowed, in the way they recognized, each in their own way, that what began as a humiliation in a lobby was no longer a small moment. It had become an arena, and there was no turning back. The conference hall did not feel like a room so much as a stage disguised as one, the kind of space where light lands harder than it should and silence spreads faster than sound. Rows of chairs stretched toward the polished platform at the front, screens glowing with charts and projections, executives murmuring in voices that pretended to be calm. They had gathered for what was meant to be a strategic presentation, quarterly outlook, partnership viability, restructuring scenarios. But beneath every neatly printed agenda was an unspoken truth threading through the air like static. Something was about to be tested, and everyone could feel it. She walked in first, posture perfectly straight, every movement deliberate, the confident rhythm of someone accustomed to controlling a room simply by entering it. The board members watched her with guarded interest, not yet adversarial, but no longer comfortably aligned. The investors sat closer than usual, their expressions too neutral to be accidental. She told herself this was still her arena. Leadership, after all, lived in performance, and no one performed conviction like she did. Then the doors at the back opened, and he stepped inside. The murmurs thinned, eyes shifted. Some recognized him from the quiet footage circulating in private inboxes. Others recognized him from headlines, and whispered conversations passed along with reluctant admiration. He didn't dress for spectacle. No suit, no armor of status, only calm presence and the steady composure of someone who had nothing to prove and every right to be there. For a heartbeat, she froze. It was barely perceptible, a pause no longer than a breath, but it slipped through the room like a crack of light under a locked door. That flicker returned, sharper, undeniable. The realization that this was not an intruder, not an opportunist, not the man she had decided he was. This was someone whose reputation did not need to announce itself. She recovered quickly, smoothing her expression into professionalism, offering a nod she hoped would be read as authority instead of defense. "Thank you for joining us," she said, voice controlled. "We're here to discuss strategic direction and external evaluation of our financial path." He didn't correct her framing. He simply took his seat at the side of the room, near the edge of the platform, not dominating, not hiding, as if he understood that the most powerful place to stand was exactly where truth could be seen most clearly. The CFO began the presentation, numbers cascading across the screen: burn rate, projected decline, risk exposure, employee attrition trends, each slide sounding less like a financial model and more like a confession printed in graphs. She interjected smoothly, shaping narrative, redirecting questions, insisting on language like temporary volatility, internal miscommunication, misaligned expectations. The more she spoke, the more the room listened, not to what she said, but to the spaces between her words. Then a board member turned toward him. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "you reviewed these numbers. Your assessment?" The room tightened. Phones went still, heads lifted. For a brief second, she felt control slide away from her fingers. He stood, not with flourish, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime letting performance reveal itself instead of arguing with it. He walked to the screen, studied the chart, then spoke gently, almost softly, as if he didn't need force to be heard. "Your issue isn't capital," he said. "It's culture. And culture always reaches the balance sheet eventually." Some faces shifted: discomfort, curiosity, reluctant acknowledgement. He pointed to a metric on the slide most people had skimmed past: leadership satisfaction drop, retention disparity between departments, a spike in departure among mid-level managers. "These numbers tell a story," he continued, "not about failure in innovation, but failure in trust." His tone never sharpened, never accused. He let the truth stand by itself. For one breathless moment, the room leaned in. She stepped forward, interrupting with a polished firmness. "Our leadership culture is strong," she said. "We hold high standards." He nodded, not in agreement, in recognition of the sentence itself. "High standards," he replied softly, "don't require humiliation to enforce them." The words didn't crash. They settled. A flicker of memory passed across multiple faces. The lobby, the refusal, the silence. Her jaw tightened. She tried to reassert momentum, shifting back to financials, to projected recovery. But the audience was no longer following her. They were following him, not because he demanded attention, but because he spoke from a place beyond ego, beyond theater. Still, the moment wasn't triumph. Not yet. The setback came quietly. A technical glitch froze the screen mid-slide. The CFO fumbled with the remote. The room murmured. Someone sighed. She seized the opening. "We can reschedule external commentary," she said, regaining poise. "We don't need further input to proceed." He could have stepped aside. He could have sat down and let the narrative close over truth. Instead, he asked softly, "May I?" The technician hesitated, then handed him the control. He bypassed the malfunctioning deck and opened a document of his own. A brief, independent analysis, nothing dramatic, no flourish of branding, only a clear, methodical map of what the company could become if ego stopped deciding who deserved to participate in it. He spoke through restructuring pathways, employee retention initiatives, leadership accountability models, long-term market recovery, not as a critic dismantling, but as a strategist restoring. The micro setback transformed into momentum. The room shifted from doubt to silence, not the cold silence of judgment, but the heavy, attentive stillness that fills a space when people realize they are finally hearing something honest. Even the executives who had aligned themselves with her authority felt it. The difference between performance and truth. She watched him, and in that watching, something inside her cracked. Not shattered, not yet, but loosened in a way that hurt. His competence wasn't loud, wasn't boastful. It was undeniable. Every assumption she had built her certainty on began to feel thin, fragile, almost embarrassing. For a heartbeat, she saw herself the way the room saw her. Not as the arbiter of belonging, but as the one who had stood between the company and the person who could have helped save it. The applause didn't erupt. It rose. Slowly, then stronger, then upright. Not a cheer, but a recognition. People stood. Not for power, for truth, for integrity that refused to perform cruelty in order to prove strength. The standing ovation wasn't for him alone. It was for the moment the room finally understood the difference between authority and worth. She remained still. The confidence she once wore like armor now felt like glass. The flicker was no longer a whisper. It was a realization spreading through her body, cold and irreversible. The performance she had curated in every room of her life was collapsing under the weight of a single, undeniable fact. His presence had revealed what hers had hidden. He didn't gloat. He didn't look at her. He didn't even linger in victory. He simply lowered the remote, exhaled quietly, and let the room sit with what it now knew. And in that silence, that absolute, undeniable silence, the truth stood exposed in front of everyone, and there was no going back to the world as it had been before. The applause did not fade the way applause usually does, easing back into conversation and polite distance. It lingered, reshaping the room as it ebbed, like a tide that refused to retreat to where it had been before. When people finally lowered their hands and returned to their seats, they did not look at her for direction the way they always had. They looked at him. The hierarchy that once lived in their posture, in the way they positioned their chairs toward her, in the way their eyes waited for her to approve reactions before offering them, had slipped quietly out of the room. She felt it before she fully understood it. Authority had not been taken from her. It had simply stopped flowing toward her. The board chair leaned forward, his voice measured, deferential in a way she had expected to be reserved only for her. "Mr. Cole," he said, "if you were to advise us on immediate next steps, where would you begin?" She opened her mouth to answer first. Habit, instinct, reflex, but no one was looking at her. He didn't hurry. He didn't capitalize on the moment or bask in it. He spoke the way he had spoken all along, steady and careful, as if words carried weight and he had no intention of dropping them carelessly onto anyone. He outlined a path, not of punishment, but of repair. Accountability structures, leadership realignment, safeguards for the people whose work had been overshadowed by ego rather than supported by it. The more he spoke, the more the room oriented toward him, not only physically but morally, as if a compass calibrated itself in real time and every needle recognized the right direction. And then something small but decisive happened. From the back of the hall, near the service entrance where staff tended to stand invisible and still, the older security guard, the one who had walked him to the door, the one who had whispered, "I'm sorry," into the thin space between duty and dignity, stepped forward, his badge catching a line of light. No one had asked him to speak. No one had invited him into the circle where influence usually lived, yet when his voice carried across the room, it did not sound out of place. "He was the only one in that lobby yesterday," the guard said quietly, "who acted like a leader." The sentence wasn't dramatic, it wasn't theatrical, but it cut through the last fragile thread of denial holding her world together. For years, she had defined leadership as control, presence, dominance, the ability to make a room bend to her will. Now, in front of the very people who once mirrored her confidence back to her like a promise, a man whose work had always existed at the margins of their awareness named something truer than anything she had ever said about herself. The room didn't scoff or dismiss him. It listened. It honored him as the first witness whose perspective mattered. And in that recognition, in that moment when the least powerful voice in the building carried the greatest authority, she understood that her power hadn't simply slipped. It had been weighed and found hollow. Investors who once rushed toward her now approached him with open notebooks and cautious hope. Colleagues who had spent years perfecting the art of admiration shifted their conversations sideways so they could include him. Even the silence around her changed shape. It no longer made room for her. It closed around her, gently but unmistakably, as if the world she commanded had become a room she was only visiting. She felt the sting of humiliation, yes, but beneath it, deeper and sharper, something else moved. The realization that for the first time in her life, she was not the subject of the story unfolding, but its lesson. He did not use the reversal to diminish her. He did not turn toward her with triumph in his eyes or bitterness in his voice. Instead, when the board invited him to remain after the session to discuss formal partnership terms, he paused, glanced across the room, and then spoke in a way that surprised even himself. "If this company is going to change," he said, "it cannot be about replacing one voice with another. It has to be about learning how to listen." The words landed not on her reputation, but on his own sense of identity, on a quiet shift he hadn't fully recognized until that moment. The understanding that he no longer needed acceptance from rooms like this to justify his worth. For years, he had walked into spaces prepared to prove himself, to carry evidence of his competence like armor. Now, standing at the center of a world that had once refused to shake his hand, he felt something unfamiliar and profound. He did not need their approval to exist here. He chose it. The identity he carried no longer bent around their perception of him. It stood independent of it, anchored in dignity rather than tolerance. The board chair extended a hand toward him, deliberate, respectful, unforced. And this time, when he accepted it, the gesture was not a transaction of status, but an acknowledgement of equal humanity. The room saw it. The room understood it. And the room shifted again. She watched from just a few paces away, her pulse loud in her ears, the polished world she had built around herself suddenly transparent. People she had once believed to be extensions of her influence now spoke without looking to her for permission. Some approached her politely, but their words were softer, their smiles thinner, their distance unmistakable. She wasn't being abandoned. She was being seen, not as the guardian of the company's future, but as the barrier it had silently grown around. The isolation did not come from exile. It came from truth. The more she tried to steady herself, the more she realized there was nothing left to brace against. Power had not been taken away in a dramatic rupture. It had simply realigned itself around someone who had never demanded it, and yet beneath the humiliation, beneath the quiet ache of watching a room she once owned no longer revolve around her, something else opened inside her, a space she had never allowed herself to feel. It was small, raw, frightening. The first flicker of understanding that what she had lost was not status, but illusion. The guard met his eyes again before leaving the room, offering the smallest nod, not as gratitude for justice served, but as recognition of a world gently tilting towards something fairer. He nodded back, knowing that if anyone in that building deserved to be the first voice the room listened to, it was the one who had seen the truth long before anyone else dared to say it aloud. As the doors closed and the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations and realigned alliances, he felt, for the first time, what it meant to step beyond a cage he had never asked to be placed inside. The unspoken expectation that he should be grateful simply to be allowed in. He was no longer inside it. He was past it. And she, standing in the echo of a power that no longer obeyed her, understood, too late, too clearly, that the cage she had built for others had always been the one trapping her most. In the days that followed, the moment in the conference hall did not remain in the conference hall. It slipped outward the way light escapes under a closed door, then grew brighter as it touched other rooms, other voices, other screens. A short clip from the internal recording, the standing ovation, his quiet assessment about culture, the simple sentence from the security guard that cut through the room like truth finally allowed to breathe, began circulating beyond the company's walls. It didn't explode into spectacle. It expanded, one post shared with a caption about dignity, one article asking how leadership could fail loudly in silence, one quiet thread written by an employee who had spent years feeling invisible and now, for the first time, felt seen. What happened in the lobby became more than a single humiliation. It became a question people were suddenly willing to ask out loud. Commentators debated power and perception. Journalists wrote about how companies fracture from the inside when arrogance replaces responsibility. Universities assigned case studies. The story slipped into conversations between strangers on trains, in office kitchens, in late-night messages between people who had lived their own versions of being judged before they spoke. He didn't seek the attention, but his name traveled with the story, not as a headline, but as a symbol of what happens when someone refuses to accept a role written for them by other people's assumptions. And with the attention came opportunity, partnerships, initiatives, requests for guidance, not framed as rescue, but as collaboration. He used each one carefully, deliberately, channeling investment toward founders who had been shut out of rooms like that lobby their entire lives. He spoke publicly not about revenge, not about humiliation, but about accountability, about systems that reward cruelty disguised as professionalism, about the cost of bias measured not in moments, but in generations. His words didn't sound triumphant. They sounded steady. They sounded necessary. Meanwhile, inside the company he had chosen to support under strict conditions, change did not arrive as a slogan or a press release. It arrived as structure. An independent audit unfolded across departments. Interviews, policy reviews, anonymous testimonies, and for the first time, people who had once believed their experiences would be dismissed, found their voices recorded, documented, taken seriously. The Diversity Council wasn't symbolic anymore. It was funded, empowered, listened to. Promotion processes were rewritten. Leadership accountability became measurable, not rhetorical. New managers rose, not louder ones, not sharper ones, but people whose work had been steady, disciplined, quietly excellent for years. The atmosphere inside the building changed slowly, then unmistakably. The brittle silence that once lived in meeting rooms softened into cautious openness, and the fear that used to trail behind difficult conversations began to loosen its grip. Employees who had considered leaving stayed. Others returned. Departments that once operated like fortresses began to function like teams again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. But it was real. And through every stage of that transformation, the witness who had spoken first, the older security guard, remained present, not as a symbol, but as a thread of continuity. He attended town halls when invited, not to speak every time, but to stand in the back and remind the room, simply by being there, that truth begins with the willingness to see what power prefers to ignore. He and the man whose hand had once been refused spoke occasionally, brief exchanges, sincere and unadorned, the kind of conversations carried not by formality, but by shared understanding. Across the city, her life did not collapse into ruin, nor did it rebound into comfort. It shifted into something far more complicated, and far more honest. Publicly, she issued a statement acknowledging harm, not as an accident or a misunderstanding, but as a failure she could not excuse. The internet did what the internet always does. Some people mocked, some condemned, some dismissed. But the reaction that stayed with her wasn't noise from strangers. It was the quiet recognition from people she once led, people who had lived the culture her actions represented. They didn't ask for her ruin. They demanded her accountability. The board realigned leadership. She stepped down, not in a dramatic spectacle, but in a measured transition that placed the company in steadier hands. Her title changed. Her office changed. Her world changed. For the first time in her career, she found herself in rooms where she was not the final voice, not the unquestioned authority. Rooms where she had to sit, listen, and face truths that did not soften themselves for her comfort. Bias coaching was not a box to check. It was weeks of excavation, uncomfortable and humbling, hours spent confronting the quiet internal systems she had spent a lifetime mistaking for instinct. She learned to hear the difference between discomfort and accountability. She learned that remorse is not a feeling, but a practice. She did not ask to be forgiven. She learned that forgiveness is not owed. And slowly, painfully, she began to understand that the price of her cruelty was measured not in what she lost, but in how many people had paid that price long before she ever noticed the bill. Months later, the story no longer lived as a trending topic. It lived as consequence. Policies had shifted. Careers had been restored. Conversations that used to end at closed doors continued into open rooms. A documentary aired, not sensational, not vindictive, just patient, careful, unflinching. It showed the lobby, the refusal, the silence. It showed the conference hall, the reversal, the standing recognition. It showed the work that came after, the systems rebuilt, the leadership reshaped, the culture redefined not by aspiration, but by accountability. At the end, it did not ask viewers to celebrate anyone. It asked them to choose who they would become in the next room they walked into. 1 year later, the company hosted its investor summit again. Same city, same hotel, same chandeliers scattering fractured light across the marble floor. But the room was different. New faces filled the seats. New voices guided the conversations. The air no longer hummed with defensiveness. It carried the weight of lessons earned rather than assumed. He arrived quietly, the way he always had. No entourage, no ceremony. And this time, when he stepped through the entrance, no one questioned whether he belonged. She was there too, not at the center, not on the stage, but near the doorway, where she waited deliberately, not to control the moment, but to acknowledge it. When their eyes met, the silence between them was not hostile, not triumphant. It was honest. She offered her hand, not as performance, not as redemption, but as recognition of the person she had failed to see. He shook it, not as validation, not as absolution, but as acceptance of the work that had been done since that failure. The witness watched from a distance, the faintest nod passing between them, three like a thread connecting past and present. The summit began. The new leadership spoke. The company's numbers stabilized. Culture surveys improved. Opportunities multiplied. But none of those metrics told the real story. The real story lived in the small details. The way people spoke up without fear. The way quiet excellence finally had space to breathe. The way rooms no longer closed themselves around a single ego. And somewhere, beneath all of it, there remained a simple, irreversible truth. Excellence had always been there. In the people overlooked, in the voices ignored, in the dignity dismissed. Only now, at last, the world had been forced to see it.